Well, thanks for jumping on here to this Auxano future casting webinar. We consider it an honor um, to lean in with leaders like you and really talk through just what God is doing. Maybe share some things we already know. Maybe share some questions we're asking that'll challenge us into places we don't know. But the idea here, as I just prayed, is to sharpen irons together. A couple of reminders: engage. We're going to be on here for about 40 to 45 minutes. Let it challenge you. Let it push you a little bit. I know as David Putman, who is co-hosting with me on this, another one of our senior lead navigators here at Auxano. You've seen and heard him before if you've jumped on our webinars. I know as we've kind of batted around some of these ideas, it's challenged us. We are thinking through some of these things and really kind of using it to sharpen our service to the local church. Focus, put down phone, social media, email, whatever it is that we tend to multitask this time. Some of you are still working on sermon and some of those things. Just kind of dial in here for the next few minutes, and we're going to do our best to make it as worthwhile as we can. And then join in the conversation. I see many of you doing that already. Jamie from Sydney, Australia it's 1 a.m. over there. You know, Jamie, we're recording this and there's replays, but we're glad you're here from down under. And we're thankful that you would take some time in the middle of the night to lay there and listen there. So hit city, state, leadership. Also, this is active dialogue today. So more than question and answer today. I want to challenge. I want you guys to think through some things. I want you guys to maybe if there's something that resonates, affirm that. If there's something you're not sure of, that causes you to stop and think, well, I don't know if that's dialed in or not. Man, let's bat that around. I think there's great potential and power when the body of Christ gets together and just talks about some things we may never have talked about before. And so it's going to be a lot of fun to do that. Huntsville, Alabama, my hometown, checking in there. It's really cool to see that going there. So 8 places disciples are made, disciple-making environments that define whole life engagement. So as an organization, Auxano serves the local church. We are full-time consultants that are on site with local churches. David Putman. David, where were you this week?
Yeah, I sort of made a round, was in Boston, New Hampshire way, and then down in Baton Rouge and back home on Wednesday. So it was sort of a whirlwind, but it was fun.
Yeah. I love it. I was only in one place this week in Virginia, about right outside Williamsburg and kind of the peninsula, the Gloucester Peninsula down there. So, we do this, all the time. And so we begin to start to think about blue sky thinking. Right now, a lot of the conversation on our team is we're really thinking about the church of 2040 and 2050. We're really kind of thinking about Gen Z, Gen Alpha. How are we helping to build strength in churches, not just today, which is the day-to-day work as David and the other team members on our team do, but how do we strengthen the churches tomorrow? How do we make sure that the church we're handing off to our kids and their kids is as strong or stronger as the church we have today until Jesus returns and takes the church home? What is that going to look like? So that's where and so some of this today, leaders, I'm just going to have to confess from the jump, is blue sky thinking. Okay, we're R&Ding some of these ideas. We're testing some of these ideas out in churches right now. This isn't solid form concrete. This is really still blue sky, still some ideas, and that's why that dialogue in the chat is important. And the reason I've asked David to kind of jump in and dialogue back and forth with me is because there's nobody on our team that's more tuned into the heart of disciple making than David is. David, with planning the gospel and his just long history of writing and just being in those disciple making environments, and many of you have sat in on webinars before. In our webinar catalog, you can go back and see some of David's really specific and micro group focused webinars there. But one of the things we'll use the term disciple making really instead of discipleship. And David, I just want to kind of set the conversation up from the jump of kind of why do we use the term disciple making, or what's the difference between discipleship and disciple making?
Yeah, well, let me go back a little bit, Brian, if you don't mind. Just be just like me not to follow the script, right?
Yeah. We worked on this quite a bit. Thanks.
But I just wanted you've said a lot, and one of the things I want to say, I'm just grateful that this is an important conversation because it's broadening the playing field, and this is part of answering this question, but it's broadening the playing field when it comes to discipleship, discipling, disciple making, all those terms we use. And so I'm so grateful that we're not talking about how to simply make disciples on Sunday morning, but we're really talking about 8 different places. So I think this is significant that we're having this conversation. And I think it's also significant that it's a little bit blue sky. And blue sky is, hey, by the way, the reason you have something as blue sky is because you recognize there's a problem that needs to be solved. And so hey, we do have a disciple making issue, a problem, challenge. And we have a great number of people on this. I was thinking, like, I hope you're not coming on here thinking we're the experts, because we're really just practitioners. I'm a disciple maker, and but none of us are experts anymore. I mean, we've got master degrees and doctorate degrees in ministry, and we're sort of back at ground level. And so, this is an important, really blue.
It's a generational issue, David. I mean, the reason none of us are experts is because generationally, we're not making more disciples than we were last generation. And we all intrinsically know that, that it can't continue this way. Right. So, I think this is important for us to even flesh out some things. Like we're going to look at some things today that are brand new. You guys are getting a sneak peek of some tools that we're not sharpened yet. We're not fully utilizing yet, but we want to kind of lay them out there and really even have a dialogue with some of you to thought. So disciple, David, your operational definition of a disciple.
Yeah, and by the way, everybody ought to work on their own definition in a lot of sense that you own and you live. And so this is something I probably developed 20 years ago. I think about changing it all the time. It's not perfect. It's a definition. So for me, but it drives me. And that is, a disciple is a follower of Jesus who's learning, right? He's learning. That makes us the disciple. And what we're learning specifically is to live like Jesus, love like Jesus, and leave what he left behind, which I have had people talk to me for years saying, hey, you need to change that word leave. It's not good. We need to say lead or something like that. But I love lead because the one thing that Jesus did was he left 12 disciples, or 11, right? And 120 in the upper room. That became a movement. And he modeled for us what could happen if we disciple a few to become disciple makers. So that's the definition of disciple maker. Now, discipleship, anytime you add the word a suffix, you change to a noun, you change the meaning of the word. So when we say discipleship, what it really implies, and this is really key, and it answers your question, why this discussion is so important. And so what it implies is the process for becoming a disciple, or the process of becoming a disciple. I think it might be even better to say the process for becoming a disciple. And because, let me tell you why that's so important, and this discussion is so important, Bryan, is because when we think about there's not a church anywhere that wouldn't say we're about discipleship. That's what we all say.
Right.
But when we say that, it communicates that we have processes and systems for disciple, for this process in place, and then whose responsibility does it become to run those processes?
Yeah.
Where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
It belongs to staff. And so we end up with a bunch of disciples and one disciple maker.
Right.
Or at best, a very few disciple makers. And so the distinction between discipleship, disciple, and disciple making is probably the most significant shift that we can make, the distinction we can make in our conversation today, in my mind. So, disciple making is just intentionally enter into a relationship with someone or someone's for the purpose of making a disciple. We say it, disciples who make disciples. That's a disciple maker. It's an intentional, and by the way, I used to think I was a disciple maker because I preached sermons. I was doing discipleship.
Right.
I wasn't making disciples. And I won't say all it did, but what it tends to communicate is you got to be a professional speaker. You got to be the expert.
Right. Well, Dave, that leads right into this question that actually Mike Gamble, one of our other senior lead navigators, who I think I saw on the chat list or on the list here is in the webinar. He asked us this at our gathering. Our team got together for a couple of days in February, and really was this kind of paradigm shifting or perspective shifting. Is the church called to make disciples or to make disciple makers? And I think that's something we've been wrestling with. I don't know that there's a clean answer other than yes, but it is a paradigm shifting or perspective shifting idea to think about, are we as church leaders making disciples or making disciple makers? I think yes, individually in our personal lives we're making disciples, but organizationally our collective vocational work maybe to make disciple makers. And how does that shift from a disciple making perspective, this thing? David, unpack the tension you have, because when I put this in front of you, you were like, I don't know that I believe this. These two statements right here.
I certainly, believe disciples make disciples.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what, I remember that conversation with Mike at our gathering, team gathering, and it was really an aha moment because I had been living it and I couldn't put my finger on what was happening.
Yeah.
We had started, some intentional disciple making in our fitness community, one of those places you're going to talk about. And we had seen exponential, like I had seen results like never before. We got to second to third generation disciple making really rapidly, and I couldn't figure out why. And when Mike said that, I realized that early on we had started discipling some folks who had become disciple makers. I didn't even know it. Didn't have a name for it, And then all of a sudden, it hit that we got to do this. That's what's missing. Are we in our churches making disciple makers, or are we content with making disciples?
So this is not a new conversation, but it is something that just kind of, just to really think about it, and even just having these reminders that equipping believers is better than entertaining believers. I think everybody on this would say yes, we agree with that. Multiplying people is better than adding people. I think everybody on here would say yes. Sending more is greater than seeding more. I think everybody is on that. And so, this is all kind of building up to the environments. But before we get there, real quick, David, we're not going to spend any time on it at all. But, this idea that there's stages of disciple making, there's different kind of, stages of being disciples. And I think there's some good questions popping up in the chat. And we want you guys to do that. We're not kind of real time answering questions. So if, preface it, hey, when you said this, what about this? Give us some context so when we come back at the discussion at the end, we know kind of at what point you were asking some of these questions. But David, just really quick, hit these 5 stages, 30 seconds here, and then let's keep moving.
Yeah, absolutely. So the answer is yes and yes to the discipleship question, just so I'm clear.
Yeah.
Yes and yes, but it's got to be yes both, right? And yes, not yes and maybe. It's got to be yes and yes. Yeah, so this is just a discipleship pipeline that I've put together in our local disciple making. And it's something that has really helped me, and we disciple 5 different groups. There's pre-disciples. Pre-disciples become new disciples growing disciples, multiplying disciples, catalytic disciples. And you can see sort of the relationship we have with them. We engage pre-disciples. We might use a tool like Discovery Bible Study. New disciples, we instruct them. We might use something like Patterson's 7 Commands. Growing disciples, we use our gospel disciple what we call our 5-3-2 disciple making method. So we coach. We have a very specific coaching system for multiplying disciples and catalytic disciples. I think we have to release them, and to be honest, I think when I talk with pastors, across the U.S. and we start talking about disciple making as movements, we start asking questions like, what does it look like for the church to foster disciple making movement? We get a little bit apprehensive because we have to release, and religion sort of controls, and we've sort of learned to control things, but some of us, and I'm one of them, we have trouble releasing things. But thinking through this sort of pipeline of disciple making has really helped me to zero in on this idea of making disciple makers and movement makers. And really, it's been a structure. So how are we going to move people all the way from pre-conversion to catalytic disciple making? And everybody, I don't think necessarily ends up being a catalytic disciple. That's a little bit of we're going to talk about calling in a minute, but it's a little bit of a calling. Yeah.
Well, and that's Dave. I think part of the reason of taking just another minute there is because the reality is when we start to think about discipleship or disciple making at the broadest level, the reality is our greatest disciple making effectiveness as a church is both gathered and scattered. We can't do all this on campus. We can't do all this on property. I'm not just talking about small groups that meet in homes. I'm talking about, as you said, releasing catalytic disciple makers to the environments where they are, right? To the environments where God has them, like really helping our people see that the places God has them. I know this is going to sound Dr. Seussian here in a minute. Oh, the places they'll go is really where the disciple making happens. I mean, that's the way it was. We read the accounts of the early church, the New Testament. It was everybody assumed it was their role to make disciples where they were, whether they were making tents or missionary journeys, all those things. It was like, hey, listen, here's that look. And I know when I bring that up, for those of you that are in the South, you see gathered, scattered, you think this is Waffle House, right? You think this is the Waffle House church. And so, it's one of those things where you kind of think about, man, this is a challenge for us that, we're going to think about disciple making. And David, this is that, and it's not necessarily just control issues as much as quality control. How do we make sure, we're being accountable for what those outputs, what those are happening there? Is that gathered and scattered? And so this has led us to think about, what I'm calling right now the disciple making environments radar. And that's kind of why the radar background there, because there's just kind of this tool that's in early stages that some of you are getting to see, whether you're watching it live or watching on replay for the first time. The first thing we think about is the approach, right? The church gathered, making disciple makers, the church scattered, making disciples. And so these two realms of the world of our people. So take a step back, think about not your work in the church as a church leader, if you're on staff, and I saw through that some of the roles there. But think about your church as members, the people who call your church my church, and their disciple making. There's the church gathered, where as organizationally we're making disciple makers, but also the church scattered, where we're out making disciples, not necessarily in the context of what's happening when we're gathered, only when we're gathered, but when families are gathered, when our folks are at work or in school, when there is, as David said, at the gym, some of those things. And it brings up Todd Wilson, the founder of Exponential, kind of really articulated this in a little bit different way, but I love kind of this form of, moving from a bias, we can do it, you can help, to leading from a base of, you can do it, how can we help? And it really is that a little bit of a shift of, the church is both gathered and scattered. And so it comes back to that both and that I knew came up in that. David, anything to add before I move on?
Well, yeah, let me just add one little simple thing. And I think it's important when we think about gathered, scattered, is that we've sort of got to redefine gather and scattered. And we'll do that in this webinar, but it's not business as usual. And I think a good place to begin, going back to words, is just sort of defining church. you know, and the way I like to define church, you might find a little bit challenging, and maybe I'll put it in chat in a minute, but, you know,
drop
church
it in
is
the
a
chat.
family. Yeah, so church is a family of disciples on mission together, advancing Jesus's kingdom by making disciples who make disciples. And so the way we see church and view church radically impacts how we do church, right? And so I think we gotta go back to that basis and say, hey, you know, what does it mean to gather? And, you know, in a disciple making church, I think the primary purpose of a gathering is to equip the saints to go make disciples, right?
Yeah.
It's what you have right here. And so it's not, and you're going to get into some of that. So let me just stop.
Yeah, we are.
Right.
Yeah, we are. And so that is a good thing. And Dave, pop that definition of the church into the chat so that everybody who wants to see it again can have it. And we're also going to send you the PDF. We're also going to have a replay, so you can go back to this, do that. If that was the approach, and we think about the horizontal as the calling, and this is two kind of levels of calling. The universal calling we have by grace through faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. That means there's kind of a universal responsibility we have toward disciple making. And so we're going to kind of break up environments in two realms. One is that universal calling by grace realm that, hey, listen, this is the joy that we all have to serve the Lord and make disciples. But then there's also unique calling by gifting. Like I am not, my good friend Daniel, those of you who were on the webinar before we started, that was his new song from Friday, Innocent Man. I love that song. I could never even try to sing that song. I don't have that gifting, right? I don't have that unique calling to worship or to serve or to make disciples in that way. But I do have a universal calling. And so this kind of horizontal thing here is kind of seeing those two things there. And here's what I'm kind of wrestling with. We're all by grace to make disciples. And so this is why it's a both and. We're all called by grace to make disciples. That's the output. That's kind of the resultant work of you know, how we obey Christ and that word in reaching others and seeing the gospel take root in other people's lives. We're all called by gifting to be disciple makers, which means that it is for us to also look, and for all of our people to look and see in what places has God placed them because of their gifting, that there is a unique opportunity to be disciple makers. And I think helping our people get this is, again, thinking for the church of 2040, 2050, helping our people see that we're not just making disciples on campus or making disciples at a certain time on a regular basis connected with the church calendar, but we are all called in our gifting and our unique calling in different places in different ways to be disciple makers. And that's really an input function there. And so we kind of lay those two grids on top of each other: the church gathered, the church scattered, universal calling by grace, universal calling by, or unique calling by gifting. And so that's where these kind of 8 environments come up. That's where we kind of think about the 8 kind of typical environments of the church gathered: worship, group, serve, mission. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Like that, there's more to going on at your church than that. But at the core, that's the heart of disciple making of the church gathered, right? Making disciple makers through worship, through group, through serve, through mission, in those ways. But then also applying this now to just as important as saying, hey, listen, when we're out making disciples as a church scattered, how does that look in our universal calling at home and work? Like, we're all called to that. And I would put school for our students in that work category. That by grace, this is a universal call to make disciples in these areas, but now also a unique calling by gifting in our neighborhoods, maybe even in recreation, and seeing that every realm of life, there is an opportunity to be disciple makers and release our people, to equip them to make disciple makers across those realms. And so, that's kind of the basic structure of this tool that's kind of in early stages, again, wet concrete, just kind of taking some shape and some form. And I'm gonna hit an overview of this, and I want to do that. David, anything before I jump into to kind of the separate 8 realms that you want to add to that?
Let me hit a couple things here. One thing that comes to mind is when we think about unique calling. I mean, I'm looking at this and it's a little bit overwhelming, And so what I want to say is, you know, that my gifting is more apostolic, more evangelistic. I've been a church planner most of my ministry, and I really live my life on the right side of this radius. You know, I
Yeah.
am, and by the way, the way I look at these is in one way I look at this is that these are different harvest fields, you know, and
Yeah.
and so my primary harvest field in my life, based on my unique gifting, is my fitness community, and we're literally making disciples that are making disciples there. It's been happening over about 2 years, and we're a little bit at a stalemate. And the stalemate we're at is now we're in need of church, you know, because
Yeah.
you know,
Time to get back to the church gathered.
and I never thought I'd be, you know, get back to the church planning phase. But, you know, Mike Breen says that if you want to grow a church, you might make disciples. If you make disciples, you always grow a church. And I apply the same thing to church planning, you know. And so I want to give a little bit of permission here that not to be overwhelmed, you know, but to realize you may fall into some of these, you know, this may be your hot spot, you know, and I think you're going to get into that a little bit later.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think it's important up front not to get overwhelmed by this and to realize that you may find yourself, like, for example, if I have evangelistic gift, I hang out on the right, you may have a strong teaching prophetic gift. Where, guess where you're going to hang out? You know, on the left. And that's why we need each other. We're the body of Christ. We all come together, you know, to be the body of Christ. And, you know, the revelation of God, the gospel springing forth flows out of us as a body best, not not out of our individualism, you know. So anyway.
I love that, David. And it is that heart to not just back up a dump truck of ideas on your proverbial pastoral or ministry staff driveway and then kind of drive off, but really to kind of again prompt some new thinking, to challenge, and really maybe even encourage that, hey, listen, you know, you're not alone, and that, you know, there is a kind of a holistic work there. Church gathered, universal calling by grace. So let's just talk kind of these first two realms. We'll call them 1 and 2, worship and group. And here's what I'm going to do. There's going to be a form for each one of these 8. I'm going to really introduce it here on the number 1 with worship, but you'll see that and repeat through all the rest of them. So worship, you know, think about this as the church gathered weekly, right? This is that, you know, church gathering weekly, a universal calling by grace to edify, praise, teach, celebrate, whatever you're going to label that, you know, however you define that worship environment. You know, for some, it's maybe more evangelical in their style, in their theology. For some, it's maybe more, you know, building up the body. Maybe it's more depth of teaching, some of those things. But listen, however you approach it, there is a disciple making opportunity, or making disciple makers opportunity in worship because of the way we approach it. We make disciple makers, therefore we're celebrating what's going on, or maybe we're teaching disciple making beyond the walls of the church, or maybe we're edifying, you know, something's going on. So this is that moment where we can see a universal calling by grace. And then this is really important, leaders. This is where, you know, you take a step back and what does this look like in our context? What does this look like to make disciple makers in our context? What words would we put in there? I like this idea of a leadership ratio. It's kind of 1 to infinite. It's kind of that leadership, or maybe it's at the moment there's maybe multiple people on your team, teaching teams or worship teams, but the reality is that kind of it's infinitely scalable there, just depending on, you know, size, services, some of those things, even sending, planting churches. And so you think about the scalability there. It's pretty big. Here's the question that comes up, and in every one of these 8, I'm going to push a question forward when it comes to the environments, and when it comes to what we're doing here, and say, hey, listen, what if our services were less about the style we prefer and more about the people we send, right? What if we taught our people that what's going on here is less about style we prefer and more about people we send out to make disciples who make disciples? And so just kind of pushing around this idea, if we start to think holistically and globally about the environments where disciples are made, then we'll do that. You know, group number 2, the church gathered educationally. So I like this idea of kind of what if we apply that adverb there, universal calling by grace. And again, this is in your context when you have groups, whether on campus, off campus, Sunday school classes or micro groups. What are we doing there? We're deep in developing care. Like, what does that disciple making or making disciple makers, take the context of? What does it take the form of there? And then that leadership ratio, typically 1 to 12 to 15. I know in some Sunday school context, you might have a 1 to 50 leadership ratio, or maybe in some micro group settings, you might have a 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 ratio there. But there is that piece of that. And then the question I put out there: what if greater spiritual maturity and effective teaching? So what if, as our groups, as our people grow in spiritual maturity and our teachers get better and better and more effective, what if it led to newer and smaller classes instead of older and larger ones? This is a paradigm shift for some of you. What if success in our disciple making and making disciple makers at that group level, that group environment, what if the better we got, that meant there were newer and smaller classes or groups instead of older and larger ones? A couple thoughts there in that. Dave, I'll pause here, let you jump in, or I'll just kind of walk to the next ones.
That's great. I mean, there's so much there, but I think the big question is how does your understanding of church and disciple making and inform your worship environments and group environments? And I'll give you one example and we can move on. Like under group, Ralph Moore is a great example of this. He calls his groups, mini churches. What does that says tons about what he believes, and he's probably the closest guy in the Western world to a multiplication, disciple making, church planting movement that we've seen.
Right.
And so this stuff does matter. Worship becomes about equipping. And we could just keep going. Right. But
you can put any action in there for worship, for group. I mean, I want to stress that the thinking here is that for each of your churches, this is going to look a little different and should look a little different because of your leadership, because of your context, because of what God is doing there, and maybe even your denominational ties or lack thereof, or theological roots. Like, it's going to look a little different. Let's go to church gathered, making disciple makers, and then the unique calling by gifting. Here's why I was kind of delineating those two things, because when it comes to serve, the church then is gathered sacrificially. Again, unique calling by gifting too. What does that look like in your context? Equipping, welcoming, imparting, ministering as people serve, as people give of their time. If we think about good leadership pipeline principles, that ratio maybe 1 to 20 team captains on Sunday mornings, or maybe ministry staff to volunteers. But here's the idea: what if volunteers saw their role as more than just accomplishment of a task, but also an investment in people? When Bob Adams, who's our great behind the scenes guy running this webinar for us, when he and I do guest experience boot camps, we talk about when you have someone who's maybe you're not even sure if they're a believer or not, put them at a front door, as long as they can smile and not be weird, and pair them up with someone who is a strong believer and can possibly disciple that person just as they're volunteering on a Sunday morning. Maybe even lead them to the Lord while this person is just welcoming and greeting people, even know that was what they're there for. So the idea that even those serve environments become disciple making and making disciple maker opportunities. Mission, the church gathered missionally. When we gather up, maybe it's on the field locally or globally. We send teams out, or we go across town to serve. It's the gifting to evangelize, help, experience. Again, whatever it is that is the heart of the reason you do mission work, whether that's in a food bank or in a foreign country. Those words there you would define. Think about that team size too. Like, how many people in that team are in leadership mature roles? And it's more than just kind of going and doing, but what if our efforts of need meeting in the community also become a front? I like this, the kind of the front for iron sharpening in the church. What if in going and serving meals to the starving, to the unhoused, really is also a great opportunity for some of your leaders to make disciple makers or to make disciples, in that way. And so there's a great opportunity and a lot of fun. Again, just kind of pushing this idea that it's not just kind of discipleship that happens in a room or a group, but disciple making that should happen throughout the whole thing. We're going to keep moving. The church scattered. Now we go to the other side. So this is away from the church locally to the church scattered, making disciples. Every one of our people out, where the Lord has them. Universal calling, though, still kind of that thing we all kind of face, which first and foremost is the home. So that's the church scattered familially. And if that isn't a word, it is as of today. It's really actually my new favorite word, familially. It's a grace to parent, train, nurture, impart. It's that universal calling that you have, even if you're not a biological parent, or a in a family structure parent. The Apostle Paul talks about spiritual fathers and spiritual mothers, and the idea that we're to nurture the next generation. And so you want to think about this in that 1-to-1 ratio of just really, how do we do this? And what if our parents purposefully led the spiritual development of their kids instead of outsourcing it to ministry programs? What shifts here if our parents in our families think about, man, there's a disciple making and even making disciple makers role they have in the day-to-day functions of their home, where, as Deuteronomy 6 says, where they lay their heads and rise up and walk along the streets and all those different places. Work, here's realm number 6. This is the church scattered vocationally. This is a universal calling by grace to witness, demonstrate, lead. Think about all your people sent out to their workplaces, to even if it's the home. Again, those kind of overlap for our fathers and mothers who are at home and full-time parents and some of those things. But you think about this idea that there is a calling by grace in those environments, right? And that may be a 1 to 4, 1 to 2 to 3, like our people thinking about those 2 or 3 people that are maybe far from Christ, or maybe even starting a Bible study in their work environment. Pretty exciting to start to think of some of those opportunities there. And here's the question: what if our people saw their workplace primarily in terms of gospel influence instead of financial affluence, right? What if it was like, hey, listen, I work where I work first and foremost for gospel influence, then also, yes, the financial affluence that happens there. Dave, I know this is kind of getting in close to your heart. Any thoughts there before we look at 7 and 8?
Man, you're just hitting it. I think about family, and the greatest joy in my life, I was just sitting here, is that I have a grown daughter that I've invested in over the last 2 years, and she's become a disciple maker. And that, like, one, it's never too late. And a lot of times when I run into folks, they're like, hey, because we do the micro group thing, and it's about one inviting one and finding their one inviting one, these little triads we do. And people are all the time going, hey, I don't have anybody to invite. And I'm like, do you have kids? Are you married? Do you have grandkids? And just start with the low hanging fruit, And so I just love the idea that, again, we broaden disciple making to these 8 environments. It's no longer one environment done by some professionals. And by the way, if we don't get out here on the edges, there's going to be no one to gather with in 2040. We've lost 27%. We went from like 70% down to 47, 23% pre-COVID, according to Gallup, of people who identify with a church, And so, if we don't, we got to get on it. We got to get out here. And I love the side of the radius here.
I think, Dave, I know this is the closest to your heart. Number 7, number 8, like being, being able to see the church scattered, but also in the unique calling by gifting. Like, what if we began to think about our neighborhood as a gift, a church scattered relationally? I'm looking across side to side, the neighbor across the street, either side, and the neighbor on either side of me. Like, what is my unique calling here to love, reach, represent, be an ambassador, reveal Christ? Teaching our people, like, hey, listen, you're a disciple maker in your neighborhood. This is a realm that, it's going to look a little different. It's not as organized, not as formal, but there's an opportunity here to love, reach, represent, whatever that looks like there. 1 to 10, assuming 2 adult households, all those 5 households, there's just kind of this me, or maybe 2 to 10, I should say. My wife and I thinking about, okay, how do we make disciples out the window there? And so this is that idea. What if everyone in the church took responsibility for the spiritual condition of their closest neighbors? Like, what does a church of 2040 look like if we start thinking about disciple making and making disciple makers in this way? Not just how many people can we get on campus, but man, what if everyone went out to where they are? And here's the last one, probably going to be most passionate about this one: recreation. The church scattered recreationally. This is a unique calling by gifting to engage, to demonstrate, to win. Like, where are your people playing in the community? David's CrossFit. I have a child that's been theater. So theater was our place. I have another child that's doing Civil Air Patrol, and so there's opportunities there. But you kind of have this idea that there's an opportunity to see these fields, these places, these realms as disciple making opportunities. Here's the idea: what if ministry leaders flipped from resentment to revelation? That travel sports teams are an unreached people group. Like, what if we stopped resenting travel sports and started equipping travel sports parents to say, hey, listen, there's something that could happen here. And maybe travel sports is just the one I picked on there, but CrossFit, wherever our people are playing in the community, hiking trails, those things. Like, what is the disciple making opportunity of the church scattered to those areas? And then as leaders, as we are making disciple makers, what's our equipping training opportunity to do that? And we're going to get to some resources there on that in just a minute, but just to think about those 8 realms. And again, as David said, it kind of feels like a lot when you look at the slide right here, but we're not asking you to do all 8 all at once. We're not saying, hey, this is, you should be great in every area. We're saying, hey, listen, are you thinking about these areas? Are you aware of the opportunity to not just make disciple makers when the church is gathered, but how do we make disciples as a body of believers as the church scattered? And how do we encourage our people to see, man, God has put you in that neighborhood for that reason. God has put you in that job for this reason. And there's some great opportunity there. So let's jump into application. Couple applications right off the top. And then some discussion. If you guys want to hit some discussion, we'll do that. You want to, question, jump back at some slides, some things like that. We're happy to do that with the time we have left. But here's the first idea: establish a strategy of engagement within the disciple making environments. So this is really the first thing, is like, how do we engage our people? We don't have to do every environment, but man, within those environments, that's where we engage our people. And so as the work of Auxano, we develop strategy. And so the opportunity here is with a coaching call, that there's a disciple making path that I put up here. United City Church, they're in Humble, Texas. You can see on the far right hand side, their disciple making environments, their strategy: gather in worship, serve in ministry, connect in life groups, live united in Christ. That's a part of their overall vision frame. And if you've read the book Simple Church, you're familiar with kind of those. What I'm asking you is to have more than just 3 words on your website, to know why those play a role that they do in the environments that they do. And so establish a strategy of engagement within the DM environments. If you want some help coaching on that, you're going to get an email following this that's going to have a link for that. We're happy as a team to get on and kind of walk through what that looks like. Here's number 2. This is something I've encouraged you along the way, but just engage people with language that moves them and localizes each calling. So in those 8 realms, or maybe you choose 3 of the 8 realms, how do you really engage people with language? Those words of, hey, listen, when we worship, this is what we're doing. And when we're in our group, this is what we're doing. When you're out on the ball fields, or when you're out, at the park, this is the idea here. We're going to send you some book resources that'll really help you execute. But here's an idea of what this might look like here. We say, like, worship, celebrating and worship by telling stories. That's how you could refine that language to really activate it. Neighborhood, loving our neighbors by hosting meals. Recreation, engaging other parents by leading Hampton Inn lobby devotionals. Like, I love that idea that we might, as leaders, make disciple makers by articulating, first assessing then articulating the opportunity in each one of these realms or a few of these realms to really kind of encourage and push our people towards disciple making in that way, and then advance. And that's what that, the resource will give you a link to. Bob's going to send that out, but just helps us really move people and localize the calling to where you are. The third idea here is to really evaluate the current state of each disciple making and vital sector. And so, that red, yellow, green idea here, I'm going to give me about a week to put this together, but I want to put together, for those of you that may be interested, kind of a poster or graphic that'll help you kind of go red, yellow, green. That'll help you kind of go, okay, listen, how are we doing in this area? Man, we really, our people could really grow, or we could really stand to equip our people as the church scattered by that universal calling by grace in their vocation. And so how do we start to think about that? Or maybe coming back around to that recreation and really arming our people for those things. And so there's an opportunity here for you to just gather leaders and just maybe even replay the webinar or walk through it yourself in your own words and say, hey, how are we doing in here? What's good? Green, we're solid there. Yellow, man, it's not 911, but needs some work. Or red, man, I think we're gapping here. There's really just opportunity here to do that. I'm gonna try to put together a poster graphic that you can print out at 11 by 17 or even larger that will allow you to have a good discussion there. And we'll send that to you in one of the follow-up emails over the next week or so. Here's the last one: equip people with resources they can use. Just equip people with resources they can use. We can't just tell them, hey, be scattered, now go do it. Or we can't just tell our leaders, hey, listen, this is what you need to do. We need to say, hey, listen, here's what we believe. Here's what we're convicted of. Here's why, and here's some resource to do that. And so 2 really good resources here. One is David Putman's Gospel Disciple Life, and I'll let him speak to that in a second. The other is Breakthrough, a new book coming out in August from Ken Brady. Ken Brady is the Lifeway small group, really Sunday school specialist there. And so, if you're on the micro strategy, small group, scattered side of things, that's where David lives in the Gospel Disciple Life. Ken lives over in the church gathered, more kind of Sunday school form of that. David, do you want to say anything about this? Because they're going to get a link to kind of some resources from you.
Yeah, super quick. This is a anytime, any place, any pace. It can be done by any person disciple making tool.
Yeah.
So literally you can give it to anyone. And let me just say one more thing here. According to Exponential and discipleship.org, only 3.7% of pastors, this is what they say, okay, from some research, bona fide research they did, know how to make disciples the Jesus way, and obedient based disciple making is what I'm assuming they're referring to there. And so this is a tool where you can do it. And then, if you've never been a disciple maker, I would encourage you to get with a disciple maker and let them disciple you to be a disciple maker, because that's really how it happens. And it really begins at that most organic level. And so this is a tool that will help you. And so it's free, download it. There's some resources where you'll go get that you can look at, and they'll help you, and they're free. So use them.
Love it. Clarifications and questions. This is an opportunity for you guys to jump in. I know someone asked to go back to a slide, so I'm going to flip back to that slide, kind of make everybody sick while I'm doing that. Hit the chat there. Where are the clarifications, questions? How do we jump in there with you guys? What'll help sharpen this idea for you? Anything coming up there? Any pushback? Like, come on, we got a few more minutes. If you want to jump on, I know some of you probably are kind of at that place, especially if you're in Eastern time. It's lunchtime. We totally get it. But really wanted to make this as useful. And again, you'll get the replay, you'll get a PDF. So great opportunity to go back over it again, think through these on your own. What does this really look like? How does this challenge you? We'll go from there. And so, again, this kind of blue sky thinking about that. How do you feel about church as a team? And unpack that a little bit more, Scott. Can you jump in the chat and just kind of give it a little bit more of a context on that? Because I do think, a team has to function toward a singular goal together. So I think that's healthy. I think sometimes though the win at all costs mindset that some teams get could be destructive, especially when you start to think about competing with other churches rather than collaborating. And so it just depends on kind of how, kind of the context of the team, their idea. Putty, what do you see on that?
Well, I just see it as a metaphor, and the Bible's full of metaphors for the church, family, body, flock, just some of them. And so I think team is a modern day metaphor that, like you said, you got to be careful when you use metaphors because what they can imply. But I think, the church needs to be a team. We are a team. I say a family of disciples. We're a team of disciples. I like team because we're playing towards something, So I think it's what works in your context, but it obviously has to be anchored in, just a good gospel-centered worldview.
Yeah, and Scott clarified that each person using their own gifting for a common goal. Definitely collaborate. I love that. I love it if we could think about our team being a larger part of a larger team in the community as well, and recognizing that what we do well, other churches may not, and what other churches do well, we may not. And I think that's the work that our Auxano Navigators do on a day-to-day basis, is help churches live in that confidence. Like, hey, this is our common goal and our calling, and this is why we're going to do these things and why we're not going to do these other things. And God bless you as a ministry if you feel called to worship in a different style, or gather people in groups in a different style, or these other things, but we're confident in who we are, and we're communicating that well with our people, so that there is that kind of thing. How do you transition an attractionally focused, a la carte ministry type church to a holistically strategic disciple-making environments focus like this? What are some core first steps to making that happen? I love that question, Greg, and I think that is a great question for 2040. The church of 2040. I think it starts with small steps. I think even coming back around and maybe gathering your worship team or whoever it is that leads, those things. Maybe it starts with if you've got a smaller congregation and you're a solo staff member, then bringing some of those key leaders around and saying, okay, listen, why are we doing these things? Let's study the scriptures together. Why are we doing the things we're doing first and foremost? And then start to think about, these environments again, maybe even run the red, yellow, green. Is there one of these environments we feel a conviction or a drawing towards? And really kind of, language. We say around Auxano that words create worlds, that, if we can attune the language and repeat the language, not just for the sake of repeating, but for the sake of really helping our people see and expounding to that. I go back to John F. Kennedy at Rice University in September in the early 60s, of just saying, hey, by the end of this decade, we're going to be on the moon. And it was a lot of work to get there, but there was an inspiration that happened when people could visualize what's going on. Dr. Martin Luther King, and we're far short of the dream he was dreaming, even today. But, just the inspiration behind that and the idea that is there, man. I love the opportunity we might have to do that. David, any thoughts for you on just kind of moving out attractionally focused?
Yeah, real quick, I'd love to address that because I do it all the time. So I think there's about 4 shifts that has to take place, and it takes time. You got to have a lot of patience and be in it for the long haul. But there's got to be a paradigm shift. So you sort of have to rethink. Disciple making as our core engine. Jesus is Lord. There's a binary code in the Jesus-centered church that we've got to sort of recapture, and requires some paradigm shifting. Then there's got to be a practical shift. So I would say go start making some disciple makers. Become a disciple maker as a senior pastor or a senior leader, and then make the church will never become what you're not. It just doesn't, And so introduce what you're talking about in a practical way. And I always say it's if you're transitioning from the top down and the inside out, not on the fringes. You got to get right in the core. And then I think there's got to be a planning shift, or a visioning shift. What does it look like to be a disciple-making church? What does it look like to be a movement of disciples in and through our congregation? And then lastly, then you go back and you begin to address the operational and identity issues and say, hey, what does it look like to align all of our systems and operations around a disciple making church? And so that's a lot of work that you probably need help with, but that's what we do, And so, it can be done, but there are a few that are doing it, but we're in desperate need to see more churches do it.
I love that. Randy's question, Randy's a lot smarter than I am. I'm trying to read up right now. He asked this question: can you compare and contrast this type thinking with Roxburgh's stuff on leadership, God's agency, and disruption? He's leaning or learning that strategic planning leads us away from fundamental kingdom assumptions to contemporary business control structures. I'm gonna push back and say solidly no on that. I think that wisdom from business planning, if we surrender to that and say, listen, that's all we're going to do, and come heck or high water, we've got a plan, and so we're going to follow it. I think that's not biblical, but I don't think you can make a biblical case for lack of planning. I don't think you can make a biblical case for not being prudent. Even just the way Luke structured the book of Acts, modeling Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, the end of the earth, which at the time the cartographer of the day would have said Ethiopia and Spain, and Paul in Romans 15's desire to go to Spain, and Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, and just kind of seeing that. I think planning is incredibly important because it aligns us and makes good use of resources, good stewardship. But I also say Proverbs 16:9 says that in his heart a man plans his way, but the Lord determines his steps. And so God has given us the agency to think, to dream, to plan, but we also have to submit that to him. And so I don't know if I've got the question completely right, Randy, because again, it seems like you're a lot more learned on this than I am. But I do know that organic sometimes is just another word for we don't have a plan. And so there is this opportunity here to not let the structures drive the spirit. Always place spirit ahead of structure, but the Holy Spirit can work in a spreadsheet. Holy Spirit can work in plans. And also, I think it's good to disciple our people when we have to change the plans, when we make an announcement, hey, this is what we're going to do, and the Lord leads us otherwise. I think that's an incredible opportunity for church leaders to demonstrate fellowship, to say, man, we thought we were going to do this, but the Lord led us over here. I know there's a lot of depth in there. And listen, Randy, jump into Mike. Mike is the smart guy on our team. He just jumped into the chat. And Jamie, thanks for jumping in from Australia. He says gotta be awake for work tomorrow, so to watch a recording. Listen, leaders, there's a lot in here. Techniques to move the needle for those in the workplace to see their work as ministry, especially those in the corporate world. Listen, Dave, is there anybody that's just jumping off for you? That corporate, it's a good technique.
I think it's an incredibly important discussion, and I think it goes back to your mind. I agree that planning is good, but man makes his plans, God determines his steps, and right. I think we got a whole planning. We got to do the best we can, and I think we got to. The problem is that planning has to be built off of the right kind of binary code. That's that paradigm stuff I'm talking about again. And, we have 5 principles in our disciple making stuff, and everything is built out of that. And one of them is relationships is our vehicle. So relationships even over our planning, but we've developed plans that our plan would include relationships. We see the gospel moving from relationships to relationships. So we think we can paint visions, we can set priorities around that, but we also understand that we got to hold things loosely, because like Jesus, we can do, we can only do what we see the Father doing. We can only join him. So anyway, that'd be a great, I'm going to think through that. It'd be a great webinar. and a full-time long discussion. I've got to jump on another one, by the way. I know y'all will continue talking, but it's just an honor to be with you, Bryan. And
Dave, thanks for jumping on.
But I'm punching out, okay?
Yeah, I love it, Dave. Thanks for jumping on. I think, Randy, that's a great question. I love the challenge of it, and it's really good to think about. How much do we try to overdo that? And all we can do is just say, hey, listen, one other technique we use at Auxano is scope setting, not goal setting. We talk about setting scope, not goal. So if we throw out numbers, if we throw out plans, it's because we want to think at a scale and a scope, not necessarily at a goal and an objective that, if we don't get it at all costs, then, it's complete failure. We say, listen, here's the scope set. We're going to trust the Lord for that. That's just that's our heart. All the people in the Auxano team who lead these visionary planning efforts, we all come from the church. We've all been on staff at a church. We all, don't think first with marketplace minds, but we do think, hey, marketplace minds, let's leverage some of that. Let's leverage some of their smarts just in the same way we would, theologians who help us, be centered on that. I love this discussion, guys, and leaders, and I'm thankful for your willingness to jump in here. I don't think this is complete by any means, but I do think this challenges me and hopefully challenges you too, to think about the church of 2040 and how your people are really viewing what their calling is and how you as a leader are equipping and training for that. So listen, team, thank you for being a part. Thank you all for the trust of this last 63 minutes. And I'm looking forward to seeing how the Lord will use it in the days and weeks to come. God bless you. May he keep you.